us.
Thank you, Yash. Hello, everyone. We'll do a small mic check, and I'll request the panelists and the chair to switch on their video so that we can spotlight you all. We have Shikha here. Okay, so we'll do a small mic check. Shikha, can you say hello or something?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, okay, you are audible. Saroja.
Hi.
Yeah, you're audible. Sanskriti.
Hey, hi.
Hi, Devanjali.
Hi.
Okay, Professor Sanjay.
Yes, hello.
Yes, you're very audible. Okay, welcome to the last and final session of.
Nikhil, just a minute.
Yeah.
Dhavalendu, do you don't have any information about him?
Oh, he's
Because
here.
he's also.
Is there, I suppose.
He's here. He's here. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Oh yeah, he's audible. Great. I'm really sorry. Okay, so yeah, we have now the last and final session of our two-day conference, and the session is on immigration and identity in Europe. As chair, we have our esteemed faculty from SIS, Professor Sanjay Pandey. He's a professor for Russian and Central Asian Studies and School of International Studies, JNU. I welcome you, sir. Thank you for coming and giving us time. I would hand over to you, and we can start the session right away.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Bhashwati. Thank you, Gulshan. We barely have 1.5 hours, less than that, in fact. I have another meeting at 4:40, so I cannot delay it beyond 4:40. So we will start at the earliest. And I'm told that each paper presenter has 10 minutes. After 8 minutes, I'll caution you, and under no circumstances you can take more than 10 minutes. All right, so timekeeping is the foremost job of the chair, which I will be doing. And maybe just 1 minute of preliminary remark and 1 minute at the end, not more. I attended the inaugural session. Beyond that, I could not, even though I can see many of the papers are of interest to me, especially in the previous session. There is no gainsaying, denying the fact that migration has become an important issue in today's Europe. And it has shaped European politics in the last 2-3 decades like nothing else, no other issue, and is likely to remain this way in the times to come. Broadly, there are two opinions. Those who believe that world should be borderless, who believe in fundamental asylum principles and want the world to be borderless, and those whom, for no better word or alternative, one can call nationalists or xenophobic nationalists, who see migration as some type of a modern version of medieval barbaric invasion, threatening the culture, way of life, civilization, and identity of Europe, democratic values as well. All right, they would like to paint a picture of Europe before migration, as if migration is a recent phenomena, and what Europe would look like after these very many migrants come to dominate Europe. So these two extreme views are there. Unfortunately, it is the latter which seem to be dominating right now, forgetting the long history of migration. After all, if you just Google and check when passports and visas started. Of course, there will be those who will trace back passports to Greek times or 2000 years or even further back. But in reality, the way we understand passports and visas are a relatively new phenomenon, not more than 100 years old. Just as democracy can be traced back to ancient Greek city-states, but the way we understand democracy is a relatively new phenomenon. So in among these two extreme views about migration and its implications for European way of life, identity, democracy, uh, we will see what our paper presenters have to say on this, and maybe at the end I'll say a few words. We have five papers and 10 minutes each. After that, at least 10 minutes of discussion is needed. So we will start right away, and the first paper is by Dhavalendu, EU Beyond Nation State. So Dhavalendu, your 10 minutes start now.
A very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for providing me the opportunity, and thank you for the organizers for giving us this opportunity to present our views and present our ideas. My paper, Nation States and EU Beyond the Nation States, has I want to present a brief outline that what I am going to speak over and what I am going to argue. Obviously, when we are talking about nation states, we have to well back into history and understand the conception that built these nations, and the conference, the circumference of nation states coming out as a modern political entity and becoming the largest source of legitimation for political mobilizations. As we move forward, I will be talking about the contradiction between nationalism and liberalism, which is the present crisis of EU and Europe is very evident. And then I will be talking about the identity issues EU faces with populism, far right wing, and further the need to take out a bright future for EU. As I start, we know that state is a political entity governed by four factors: government, population, sovereignty, and territory. Whereas nation exists like a cultural political community that emphasizes coherence or homogeneity with ideas, history, region, culture, civilization. We have understanding of imagined communities by Benedict Anderson, and then abstract community characterization of Paul James. We see, obviously, we have to situate EU in this understanding, but as we go back to 19th century and we see the rise of states in Westphalian order, we see the rise of nationalism as expansionist policy, as a policy to gain more territories. Then it went into explain and justify colonialism, imperialism, and further when we move away, we see the rise of fascism, authoritarianism, and followed world wars in Europe. The nation states here are not very identical as we use in common jargon. Nation represents cultural, emotional, and civilizational aspect, whereas state is a very political aspect. But since the coming of modern world, and when we see a new world order established, nation states quite conjoined and become a singular identity. Further, when we see when we see the evolution of European Union came into being in a post-national identity. So when there are very conception that EU has always been antithetical to nation or nationalism, but here comes the concept of embedded liberalism given by political scientist John Luque and Karl Polanyi's The Age of Transformation, where we see liberalism providing space for national autonomy, at the same time cooperation, where post-national identities can survive together and go for economic transformation. EU ensured that aggressive militarism or aggressive nationalism of world wars remain controlled in remain controlled or remain boycotted within the peace and prosperity of Europe. As Habermas argued that Europe needed the post-national identity to survive, but it's also not very feasible that we can expect something like United States of Europe or a very federal Europe. European Union has been a very overhyped body of supranationalism, but it's not mean to ever compromise the political existence of nation states. And as we move further, the contemporary nation state is not the nation state as a sovereign entity per se, because they share sovereignty with many actors now. It's not necessarily that the traditional nation state exists as a isolated territory. We see with globalization, end of Cold War, and advancement of technology, many hyper globalists and many have written obituary for the existence of nation states. But this is something which we have to situate in the ideological development post the world wars. As we see Europe war torn and economically weak, we see certain nations like Germany, France, UK, with help of the US, try to share some of their sovereignty to gain larger foothold for their nation states. It's just that the EU project has never been something which compromised nationalism. It always, in my argument, it always supplemented nation states and strengthened their authority over their citizens or over their resources. However, as we move forward in the 70s and 80s, the nationalism took a new wave, and as European Union became more stronger, and treaties like Maastricht Treaty or Lisbon Treaty, it has gained more structural legal shape and constitutional obligations. But at the same time, what we have seen that ideas of market fundamentalism and logic, a logic of market, which try to control the role of government in administration and citizens' life gained. The ideas pioneered by Hayek or Milton Friedman was followed by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in their own countries. And at the same time, these ideas were for the use of countering the social democratic left, which was ruling at that time. But soon the social democratic left adopted the same ideas of market fundamentalism and logic. And at the same time, there's curtailment of welfare state. The curtailment of welfare state increased economic exploitation and economic difficulties of people, citizens basically of Europe. And that's where we see the present problems of nationalism, the present crisis of nationalism. The difference between 19th century, 20th century nationalism and 21st century nationalism, that they are driven by different factors. These are factors which are always there, but they have taken a shape where it has become problem for the existing ruling elites to counter them. Or at the same time, when we see there is a rise of far right wing, we have to also see that there is also a rise of far left. There's no moderation, or there's no midway in between far right or far left. Either we see very hyper optimists who want a federal Europe, very united Europe, and Europe without any nation states, without the political authority of nation states. But the same nation states goes to elections and face the wrath of citizens, which see the EU project as very elitist. As the EU has grown past their own stature, we also see the voting pattern of elections in EU has downgraded. Recently, only in 2019, they have seen a upward movement towards their electoral voting. Otherwise, there is a consistent decline. At the same time, citizens in Europe face quite a surge of democratic deficit, with indifference to elections. At the same time, split ticket voting, voter apathy. These are common phenomena of Europe. And at the same time, when we see the demography of Europe, there are people who are more angry or anguished of Europe, who are old age and who have seen the European Union grow. And it's certainly that European Union has their own lacunas. That it's a very complex bureaucratic structure. which has not been able to provide any direct democratic credentials to their citizens. And these are governed by head of states, and head of states follow the policies or follow the idea which is prevalent at this time. This technocratic
Dhavalendu,
exercise.
wrap up. You have 2 minutes left. No more.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir.
Please wrap up.
I would like to say that when we see the rise of populism or far right wing, far left wing, at the same time immigration debacle and other factors which is the crisis EU is facing, we have to remember the idea of Karl Polanyi of embedded liberalism, where institutions has been used to strengthen the authority and lighten the burden of nation states for their citizens. So as we move forward, Europe has to find out a way, midway. It's not cannot be that nation states can wither away, or it cannot be that European Union will wither away. As we see in the current time, crisis helps nationalism grow. At the same time, crisis has helped the European Union grow. So European Union will be relevant, and so that nation states, and they will find a new political creative construct. And I'm sure that democratic credibility and political policy flexibility will help in this process. Thanks for my time.
Thank you, Dhavalendu. Dhavalendu basically talked about the evolution of European Union, how from being seen as a post-nation state, post-nationalism phenomena to one that has in fact strengthened nation states. Dhavalendu made his point. Of course, I would have wanted him to speak something about migration, related to migration, but maybe in Q&A. The next speaker is Saroj Jha, Assistant Professor, Ramjas College, and he will be speaking about between ethnos and demos, common identity and fear of the other in Europe. All right. Interesting. Saroj, your 10 minutes start now.
Thank you, Professor Pandey, and many thanks to Center for European Studies for extending this opportunity for me to interact with all of you today. Now, I shall try to belong to, as it is said, the Henry VIII School of Speaking, who told all his wives that I shall not hold you for long, but I do not know how to actually execute that in practice. So I shall anyway try to hold it within 10 minutes. And you know the theme already, and I shall straight away delve into the discussion. And which is to say that there is a paradox which informs Europe. And this is basically, I take the baton from Dhavalendu, and I agree broadly speaking with many of the things that he said. And I'll just take the discussion further on, that there is a paradox which informs Europe, and it is the idea of Europe imagined as one, posited against multiplicity of European imaginations. Now, it finds articulations through meta-theorizations versus micro-imaginations, sometimes manifest as a call for the establishment of a demos, at others as an assertion of ethnos. In words different, it can be said that this is course, that is how to strike equilibrium between the idea of unity in Europe and that of the diversity within Europe, is a theme which is writ large in almost every imagination of a common Europe. Now, can there be a charter of Europe, defining what it means to be European, as ex-Czech President Václav Havel had proposed in 1994? And to what extent and in what ways will the discursiveness of the European identities frustrate efforts at having so? Romano Prodi's submission to this paradox was to argue that Europe's destiny is not inherently Eurocentric, but one of universality, with the idea of universality being imagined as an aspiration for a new cultural identity, while extending mutual acceptance among Europeans of their cultural diversity. Now, this position did not go uncontested, and was rather robustly qualified by people ranging from academics such as John Gillingham and to that of ex-Czech President Václav Klaus. And now here the pertinent question is that who is actually speaking of a common European identity? Is it the common European people situated within the European space, bifurcated into various nations and nationalisms, differing cultural identities and perceptions of the self with varying experiences and attitudes towards democracy, democratic institutions, liberalism, liberal ways of life, or still the perennially unfolding, albeit without surprises, the new manifestations of advanced capitalism? Or is it a discussion which is the limited and exclusive domain of elites, be they political, intellectual, economic, or cultural? The critical point here is that who wants integrated Europe, constructed around the desirable and what we say the Kantian nominal idea of one Europe, and who is going to, as Slavoj Zizek had once opined, die for that idea? Now, meta-narratives of demos basically have been formulated about this conception, and it has been argued that Europe of the EU has been constructed as having an underlying unity of embracing a modern universalism, of constituting a demos rather than an ethnos, of being held together by a decentered culture, of representing a network of differences, and of being little more than a thin discursive identity anchored only in dialogical structures. And at its most simplistic, elites have referred to the EU's unity in diversity, which is hardly a revolutionary idea, so to speak. The European right, on the other hand, is less divided over this issue on the issue of unity versus diversity, since it posits that national cultures are separate, and for them, they cannot in any way be reconciled with the concept of unity as such. Now, one school of thought emphasizes the communitarian nature of Europe. That is the existence of people unified by a basic cultural foundation. Yet another school points to the republican roots, that is a civil society or demos that transcends class, ethnic, and party divisions and is willing to take on mutual responsibility for a shared culture. And this brings us to the Kantian notion of a people defined by civic consciousness of demos rather than that of a state. Now, juxtaposed to this idea is the idea of has been the idea of Europe, wherein it has been constructed as an ethos, a morally superior European system that transcends parochial or illiberal national values. In this view, the EU is fundamentally a moral union. This understanding was reflected in EU's Millennium Declaration of 1999, which describes the ties, within quotes, the ties that we bind in these terms. And it was pontificated that the union citizens are bound together by common values such as freedom, tolerance, equality, solidarity, and cultural diversity. Now, academics such as Tony Judd took this objective at face value when they praised Europe's 21st century normative regime as a model for all to emulate. Now, let us ask this question in this context, that is, are there any elements of organicity in any of these formulations? And our approach here must be determined by the perspectives that we invoke, which is whether our take about the European question is premised upon a bird's eye view or a worm's eye view of the issue. Now, approach from the first perspective, it can well be argued that Europe is one and should move towards becoming ever more unitary, unified, and united. And the underlying argument that can be built to argue such a case can be situated around the idea which Tzvetan Todorov, Franco-Bulgarian philosopher, had once posited, and which is in its essence is about certain values such as rationality, justice, and democracy. Now, one needs to remember that these are values and may not necessarily be practices, or still values turned into practices. Nevertheless, these ideas are emphasized upon to derive home the message that Europe or European discourses or still discourse around Europe is unique. How unique? It indeed is rather difficult to gauge, since the history of Europe does not bear witness to the overt celebration of this singularity of a rather prescriptive vision. And also, in what ways does it make the European civilizational experience different from other two is in more ways than one in the domain of circumspect. Nevertheless, with all consciousness built into this submission, there are still other arguments which align themselves with such a mode of thinking and seek to celebrate uniqueness of the European experiment. So scholars such as Umberto Eco or French philosopher Attila Balibar have held the idea that Europe's tradition-bound practice of speaking and listening, of teaching and learning, of understanding and making oneself understood marks a perception of Europe of itself as different from the others. Now, does it actually mean to say that other cultures and traditions do not have these negotiational devices built into their discourses about themselves with others. And I presume not necessarily so, because every culture and civilization has its own devices to conduct such conversational exercises. And there is nothing unique about this European experience so far as search for unique raison d'etre in terms of greater concreteness and realism of Europe is concerned. The enterprise does not end here. The European Union experiment has also been conceptualized in terms of governance, wherein the latter shall entail centralized rule over a territory. And in such enterprise, inbuilt shall be the effort to combine or bring together a combination of state, non-state, public, private, national, and international actors. Further, commercial, labor, interest groups, civil society, epistemic communities, groups with specialized knowledge, public-private partnerships, and various agencies and networks are all increasingly desired to be brought under the purview of a pan-European institutional governance. And the architectural technicalities of such an arrangement are envisioned in terms of vast expansion of the idea of governance, which would have not only an unlimited horizontal spatial reach, but a vertical depth of similar proportions as well. In words different, it is a call for the institutionalization of a supra-state involving interlocking regional, national, and supranational institution. Now, this thinking was attempted to be given a concrete shape through efforts made to build up independent regulatory authorities in areas such as ecological and environmental issues, health and safety at work, food and aviation safety, and racism and xenophobic issues. When we're not letting,
Please wind up.
Yeah. So when we're not letting imagination unleash in ethical terms, advocates of oneness of Europe, resort to advancing instrumentalist visions of Europe, premised upon commercial interest and market efficiency. Now, if you actually juxtapose this idea of one Europe and a certain moral idea associated with it, and try to look at it historically, how Europe has evolved over a period of time, there is a counterfactual position, which we rather say a long durée reading of history, and which is mostly a phenomenal position. And they provide us with an opportunity to have a worm's eye view of the issue. Now, which Europe are we talking about? The question is perceived from below. There are many Europes as one can visualize. Even in terms of being a geographical entity, there is no certainty. Where does it end? Does it end at the given boundaries of existing EU member states, or does it end at the Urals? The expansion of EU2 in the past has been conducted more in response to the expediency of politico-economic and geostrategic concerns than with reference to a holistic underlying cultural understanding. So in other words, there is an arbitrariness about the issue, and past also tells us that different regions, cultures, and people of Europe have responded in absolutely a diverse manner to the calls of modernity, Enlightenment values, the emancipatory and revolutionary calls of the French Revolution of 1789, liberal ideals, constitutional reforms and institutions, nationalism and processes of nation formation, capitalism and more so industrial capitalism, coming of mass politics and mass politics and mass participation in politics, issues of race, religion, ethnicities, minorities, and a host of other issues. Now, what is the way out of this paradox, you see? And the way out of this paradox, which essentially what I perceive to be a conflictual relationship between meta discourses and of a desire of one Europe and that of the micro discourses of people situated in the specificity of their experiential, national, cultural, social ecosystems, are a couple of points. The first one, and this may sound prescriptive, is that drop the meta-narrative presentation of the project or the pretensions of the project. Strive to bring about, as Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci had proposed with reference to the contestation within cultures, that is about a compromise equilibrium between the calls of ethnos and demos, respect the micro and give it its due respect and place in the imagination of the macro, allay the fears of the other within and others outside, rather than homogenizing every difference couched in the project of Europeanization. Accept difference, disagreements, and distinctions as they are, enter into series of what Jürgen Habermas would say, communicative action and negotiation with non-negotiable idea of liberalism, democracy, and fundamental human rights as at the center of One Europe discourse. And last but not the least, make this enterprise of One Europe as a celebration of diversity, specificity of human historicity and experience. Now, mandarins and policymakers in Brussels, need to realize that the desired charter of Europe need not be an imposition, but should rather be effort, a dialogue wherein detailed deliberation and equal participation be the prerogative of all. And any imagination of One Europe should have as its cornerstone the idea of it being decentered enterprise rather than being a singular unitary monolithic whole, and make European experiment a voluntary and enthusiastic coming together of people, cultures, ethnicities, and nations, rather than a holding together enterprise through recourse to a matrix of legal arrangements and impositions conducted surreptitiously and from beyond the veils of visible and tangible. So I personally feel that this whole conflict, which is there between the idea of the demos and conceptualized in meta-narrative terms and that of the ethnos, wherein people respond to this imposition of the concept of a One Europe, a gigantic, intangible Europe, is born more out of fear, more out of concerns which need to be allayed than, out of a genuine non-idea of a non-negotiation of kind of a thing. That brings to an end to itself.
Thank you, Saroj. You took 3 minutes more, but it was really interesting, referring to a wide range of scholarship and readings. You basically discussed what is Europe, the idea of Europe, what is universal about Europe, meta-narratives versus micro-narratives, and the relevance of diversity. Thank you once again. The next paper would be this is by Shikha, Cultural Psychology and Identity Negotiation in Europe. Shikha.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you, sir. A very good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Center for European Studies, for giving me the chance to present my paper here. As Saroj sir has already set the ground for me, because he has already discussed the meta-narratives and the micro-narratives on which I'm going to present my paper, which will broadly look into the psychology of Europeans, how they perceive their identity, whether in a European sense or in a national sense. So before going further or deeper into the European context, I would like to set the ground by making a comparison. So while looking into the United States of America, it has not only created the American dream through its strategic foreign affairs and soft power, but it has also introduced the whole globalization concept in which most part of the world cooperated, either actively or passively for a long time. And this wheel of globalization does not have a turnaround, as we can see. However, Europe being the epicenter of colonial power, unable to create the American charm in order to integrate itself, let alone outside the Europe. In this light, this title defines the presentation. It looks into the cultural, culture from an individualistic perspective and how it shapes the collective identity. So this paper is divided in 4 parts. The first is what is identity. The basic broad concepts of identity. It will discuss the modern and the postmodern narratives of identity and the conception of European identity. The next one is, the third one is the factors that are hindering the pan-European identity among the citizen. And then I'll conclude by, with my basic findings. So while looking into the conceptions of identity, so speaking of the modern idea of identity, it is based on the meta-narratives, based on the principle of enlightenment and Western philosophy. And it was very much Eurocentric in nature. In contrast to that, the postmodern conception of identity creates socially constructed collective identity that are multiple, uncertain, and have consequential similarities among them, which ultimately construct the significant other group. For instance, people who grow up in a certain kind of family or a society is a socially located identity. Also, identities are always described as Hegel and Kant describe it as people desire to mastery over others. Hence, the us versus them conception is always present there, either in modern sense of identity or the postmodern sense of identity. While looking into the conception of European identity, I would like to put some data about how Europeans perceive their identity in terms of whether they feel more associated with their national identity or with their European identity. So 2014 Eurobarometer data showed that only 3.8% of the people associate themselves exclusively with the European identity, while 8.8% see themselves as European, also having some national identity. So, according to this, the 3.8% means 47 million people considered themselves as European. So this data shows some interesting fact, despite considering it, a pessimistic data in terms of, integrated European identity. Those people who view themselves as European along with national identities can be seen as situational European. That is, under right condition, they will put their European identity over their national identities. The 2018 Eurobarometer survey show a decline in those who consider themselves European exclusively, with 3% European only, and 7% consider themselves both occasionally. Apart from that, 41% of them claimed that national identity first and sometimes European identity, and 46% explicit about their strict belief in the national identity. Now it is a matter of speculation that on what ground people find themselves associated with their European identity, because if the situational Europeans remain true to their national identity, 87.3% people would not be European. So in countries like Britain, Sweden, Austria, Denmark, or Hungary, people are more attached with their national identity. And the reason for that is they believe in how democracy works in their countries and find themselves grounded in terms of strong historical attachment and democratic governance. Here, the whole European versus national identity has ups and downs, where the people are generally prefer to speak on the behalf of their national identity, but on some grounds, they are collectively European. Now, understanding those grounds and look at who are on what side is equally important. The European identity has shaped in two ways. One is civic identity and the other is ethnic identity. Looking into the civic identity, it belongs to the European virtues, such as human rights, democracy, and the legacy of enlightenment. The ethnic identity, on the other hand, belong to the national cultural tradition, history, and associated events. Hence, in the Eurobarometer survey, those finds themselves attached with the European identity, find themselves close with the holistic or cosmopolitan values of Europe than the other. Now, it is not the case that these are two fine divisions are there, and the national and European identities are incompatible to each other, because they are two different communities nested with one another and are activated in different social conditions. For instance, the Spanish identity is not only unthreatened by the European identity, but empowered by it. So the Spanish view themselves as a member of EU and as European, as they have arrived as a member of functioning democratic society. Now, what are the factors that are barring the pan-European identity among the citizens? So three factors are very much important. First is the union and the threat to the national identity. So with the expansion of the European Union, many of the national identity felt threatened as union becoming supranational entity. Hence, the European countries feared that it might overpower them in the matters of governance by snatching their right to decide in the favor of their national interest. While some of the European thus does want to have the economic benefits from the EU, but they do not prefer to do that on the national or the cultural basis. And this is why when the EU was formed in 1951 with economic integration, which further added the political and the social angle to it through the Maastricht Treaty, the European welcomed it. Some of the Europeans welcome it, but most of the Europeans were passive about it. But when the union penetrate deeper into the political and cultural life of the nation, they fiercely negated it. Now, the second thing is the blurring divide between the East and West Europe. After the demise of Soviet Union, the dominant other has become powerless. The Soviet Union has become powerless for the Europeans, but with the accession of the ex-communist countries, these countries were seen as a threat to the Western European values. However, by exhibiting the signs of robust economic growth in the post-transition period, they proved that they are not the threat, but an equal contributor to the prosperity of the European continent. The third and the most prominent is the immigration from outside of Europe. From 1950s, European countries are witnessing a significant growth in the arrival of migrants from Middle Eastern and North African countries and the Balkans. And these immigrants are in continuous conflict with the European on ethnic and religious lines. These differences occur in the legal practices of European countries by headscarf controversy, minaret ban, and different remarks from politicians on the policies of multiculturalism in their countries. The perceived and sometimes real threat from Muslim has a salience, particularly after 9/11. These factor in the form of institutional integration, geographic expansion, and immigration increasingly defines Europeanness to others. This means that
you have to wind up in 2 minutes. Please wind up.
Yes, sir. These means that the stereotype non-European is often the non-white immigrant or the indigenous Roma or Jews. These are the classic scapegoat against which the national and sometimes the European identity construct. In this context, the rise of far-right parties needs to be looked into, where they are continuously tries to protect the national identity by being skeptical to the EU policies of opening the border and the idea of equal economic participation by all. The recent Eurobarometer survey in 2019 showed the public opinion on increasing immigration and came with the result that more than 60% of the respondents believe that immigration is a bigger issue than pension, terrorism, environment, and foreign affairs. And 50% of the respondents are against the immigrant of different race or ethnic group. This public opinion show that how the perceived perception and threat is reciprocally shared by the far-right parties and the European citizen as well. Now, coming back to the core question, again, that is how many see themselves as European, and this question brings us to the conclusion that majority of European population associate with their national identity by keeping it on paramount than the European identity. If we go deeper into the whole supranational versus national identity, we will see that those who are getting benefited from the cross-border interaction are see themselves European, no matter they're doing this out of choice or they're forced to go for cross-border interaction. On the other hand, the blue-collar workers who are not at all benefited from opening the border or the free movement have defended their nation. The unevenness of the European integration is further going under the accommodation test by recent blows such as economic crisis, migrant crisis, and Brexit. For now, the national identities are getting stronger, and it needs deeper political, economic, and social cooperation to make the European identity possible. Thank you very much, sir. This is all.
Thank you, Shikha. Shikha basically talked about the issue of European identity and what are the various conceptions about European identity, and most importantly, how immigrants are perceived, seen by majority of Europeans, threatening their identity or something akin to that. So thank you. The next paper is by Debanjali Ghosh, Urban Sanctuary Initiatives Across Europe Towards an Alternate Model of Community Membership. All right, interesting. And where
sir.
immigrants fall into that.
I will just share my presentation once.
Mhm.
Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
So my topic is urban sanctuary initiatives across Europe towards an alternate model of community membership. Now, urban areas have always been attractive for immigrants because of the accessible labor market, the higher standards of living, established co-ethnic communities, and also relative anonymity for undocumented immigrants. Now, for the purpose of the study, undocumented immigrants have been defined as individuals who are not the citizens of a European country, but are present within the territory of the European state without the permission of residence by the state. This population includes both adults and their children, but excludes asylum seekers with pending decisions. Europe has had a substantial population of undocumented immigrants, but this population is always vulnerable to economic exploitation. Moreover, they lack social assistance like shelter, medical assistance, education, and justice. And owing to the fear of deportation or being put in prison, they are inhibited from seeking support from the authorities. Now, it is the states that guarantee the rights of an individual, but with increasing xenophobia and the rise of the right wing and anti-immigrant sentiments, this population has become more and more vulnerable. However, in this context, we find that Europe has also experienced the rise of urban sanctuary initiatives, which is an umbrella term for policies and practices adopted by some cities to guarantee social rights to all their citizens, irrespective of their nationality or legal status. This is rooted in the notion of urban citizenship, which calls for the membership of all people who inhabit the city by virtue of their physical presence in the city through their residence. It is based on just domicile, that is the right of residence, which is acquired through residence and also lost by abandoning it. Thus, it creates a more binary division in a city between those that are residents and those that are not. So why have some cities adopted this initiative? First is humanitarian concerns. No human being is illegal, and all individuals, irrespective of their legal status, are entitled to basic human rights like right to life, physical integrity, human dignity, shelter, medical assistance, and so on. Thus, it has been argued that undocumented immigrants are without papers, but not without rights. And in this international human rights regime makes it incumbent upon cities to cater to the needs of undocumented immigrants as well. However, there is a strong sense of pragmatism which also marks these initiatives. Undocumented immigrants are not illegal constructs, but they are individuals who are already physically present within the national territory of a state, living and working among citizens as de facto members of the community at the local level. They have a myriad of identities like the city's workforce, homeowners, neighbors, customers, parents to school children, and so on. As Benjamin Barber put it, the politics of the city have a very different character from the ideological politics of the nation. They are about making things work. You've got to pick up the garbage. You have to keep the hospitals open. It doesn't matter if the immigrants are legal or illegal. They have children who get sick, who have to go to school. They ride buses and they drive cars. In this sense, legal status becomes less important than social problems, and this practical reality makes cities more accommodating to this population. Cities have adopted certain policies and practices with the aim to establish resident status, ensure rights, and create a sense of belonging among this population. Now, one instrument has been through registration, which has been particularly successful in Spain, especially in Barcelona. Spain already has a municipal register which requires every resident to register with the local authorities, irrespective of their immigration status. And it has acted as a symbol of local membership, granting access to social services, education, healthcare, and so on. Now, Barcelona has been proactively encouraging this registration even to undocumented immigrants who lack residence proof, which is a primary requirement if you have to register with the census. Now, local ID cards have been adopted by cities like Paris with its Carte Citoyenne, Bern, Zurich with its Zurich City Card, Madrid, Barcelona, and so on. They were inspired by the New York City's local identity cards. And they do not change the legal status of undocumented immigrants, but they provide us a document of identification which makes it safer for them to travel the city, participate in local commerce, access mainstream services like healthcare and education, and even interact with authorities like police officials. Now, several measures have been undertaken by some of the cities to ensure greater rights for this population, but in many cases, they have adopted an arm's length approach, often partnering with NGOs or working informally to ensure that there is no paper trail. In many European countries, undocumented immigrants only have access to emergency healthcare, but cities like Warsaw, Florence, Berlin, Hamburg, Dusseldorf, Munich, and Barcelona have gone beyond that to ensure basic healthcare rights to this population. For example, Warsaw uses public funds to fund healthcare for this population, and Berlin and Hamburg have experience with anonymous medical insurance where they would not be asked their legal status. Coming to food, Athens has circumvented rules restricting access to food banks for those without legal status by allowing anyone to take food left over at the end of the session and always ensuring there was sufficient food for undocumented immigrants. So even if they cannot be recognized officially, in practice, they are accommodated. Access to housing is a major challenge for undocumented immigrants and also perhaps one of the most primary needs in a new country. Dublin, Genoa, Utrecht, Munich, Cologne have all undertaken measures in this regard. Now, for example, Dublin uses Ireland's lack of legislation that requires officials to inquire legal statuses for those requiring shelter. And in Utrecht, shelter and advice services are funded by the municipality. Utrecht has also adopted a very innovative approach known as win their case by losing them, whereby the local authorities follow national policy and refuse accommodation to this population, knowing that they would be challenged in court on the violation of the grounds of social rights, but at the same time purposefully exposing the national government to censure in front of the European Committee of Social Rights on the breach of obligations for under the European Social Charter. Now, coming to education, majority of the EU states entitle the children of undocumented immigrants to attend schools, but this implementation of this happens at the discretion of the local authorities and even in schools. But places like Ghent and Amsterdam and St. Nicholas in Belgium have taken up initiatives to support the population. For example, Ghent issues bus passes for the city for undocumented immigrant children as well. And also Amsterdam assists undocumented families to purchase school-related materials through a scheme called Learning Without Papers. Now, creating an identity and sense of belongingness. To express solidarity with undocumented immigrants, cities have tried to brand themselves as sanctuary cities or cities of refuge. At the international level, there has been an increasing number of human rights cities whose urban policies are based on international human rights law. And about 400 cities have signed the European Charter for Safeguarding of Human Rights in the city. Among these are Utrecht, Palermo, Barcelona, Freiburg, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen. Now, Barcelona, through its measures like anti-rumor strategy, have also sought to dispel popular myths about undocumented immigrants, like they don't pay taxes or they take our jobs or they lead to the collapse of the healthcare system. Now, with the help, the cities are less of an imagined community because they play an important role in the daily lives of the undocumented immigrants. And this, coupled with such welcoming campaigns, have helped create a sense of belonging among this population. Now, there was a study conducted by Gebhardt in 2016, which found that sections of immigrant population, which includes both legal and undocumented ones in several cities, like Amsterdam, Barcelona, Madrid, Berlin, and Copenhagen, very strongly identify with their city of residence and the state. And as we have seen that all these cities have undertaken some sort of urban sanctuary initiatives or another.
Yes, Debanjali.
Yes, sir.
2 minutes, maybe
yes,
one.
I'm just concluding.
Yes.
So to conclude, urban sanctuary initiatives have created a disjuncture between the essentially exclusionary national approach and the more inclusive one at the local level. It has re-articulated the question of who belongs. And through this regime of practices, it has come up with an alternate route for membership for undocumented immigrants by virtue of their residence in the local community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debanjali. It was interesting. And when you said that immigrants may be without papers or documents, that doesn't mean that they don't have rights. They are not without rights. And the initiatives taken by various cities and countries in this respect were detailed by you, which was very useful. I'm just reminded of a small incident. I'll take 1 minute. I study Northeast, Naga especially, and I remember one incident which happened around 60 years back when in 1960, the foremost Naga leader Angami Zapu Fizo landed in Europe without any documents and papers. And he was asked about visa, about passport, about invitation. And he said something very interesting. He said, 100 years back, he was speaking in 1960, and he asked the British airport authorities, 100 years back, when you came to Nagaland, did you bring any visa, passport? Did you have any invitation? Did anyone invite you to come to Nagaland? And today you are asking me for a document. And he, in fact, was given asylum. So it's really interesting how various countries and cities have taken certain initiatives to protect at least the basic fundamental right of the immigrants. Thank you, Debanjali. The last presentation is by Sanskriti. All right, and she will be speaking on wedged between Brexit and pandemic, the lives of Calais refugees. Very interesting. So, Sanskriti, please, 10 minutes, no more.
Thank you, sir. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all the wonderful presentations and for setting the ground actually for the conversation for the last final paper. Interestingly, this is a panel on immigration and identity, but I'm not my paper, which is called Wedged Between the Pandemic, Wedged Between Brexit and the Pandemic and the Lives of Calais Refugees, does not deal with any particular identity, but maybe I think we can actually think of taking refugees as an identity in itself, the term refugee. So while a few caveats, while going through the research for this paper, the terms like migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, exiled and displaced persons, these were used quite interchangeably, but I want to say that the main group of people that my paper is targeting is consistent with the United Nations 1951 Convention on Refugees, which says that a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, owing to such fear, or is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. And that is exactly the story of what has been going on in the region of northern France called Calais, basically, but also Dunkirk, which is 47 kilometers from Calais, Grand-Saint, and basically northern France, coastal northern France, which borders the world's busiest shipping route, which is the English Channel, and is also the shortest distance to reach the United Kingdom from any part of the European mainland. So I begin my paper by saying that human distress has been a driving force behind the movement of people from one place to the next since the beginning of time. And that is exactly the sentiment which has been expressed in several papers, which have been presented before mine. And I will take you through a short summary of the paper. Now, this paper is divided into around 5 sections. this paper will first aim to study the historical circumstances which has established Calais as a hub of migrant movement. Then it will try and decode the often puzzling details of the Brexit and where the deal presently stands, including its import for Calais, the security arrangements and the treaties signed between the French and the British governments, which become crucial to this conversation as it determines the fortification of the English Channel. The next part of the paper deals majorly with the aid agencies and the humanitarian NGOs and charities working on the ground in Calais. Now, this is where like the main part of my paper comes in, because it lists out the methodology used for the research and what are the findings of like the methodology that I used for this paper. Now, I will end it with a charting of the trends, shifts, and immediate prospects for the refugees of Calais. Now, let's begin. So Calais is essentially, it started as fisher folk. It started as a fishing village in around like, you know, that those are the earliest origins of in the 8th century. And then it was like a site of political contestations between arch rivals France and Burgundy, when Edward III of England made it captured it, taking advantage of this rivalry, and made it England's most, it became England's most fortified military base. So Calais has actually it's an interesting link between France and Britain, because it also has like a history to it, where it was in occupation of England at certain points and of France and the empires of Burgundy at certain other points. The Napoleonic Wars also used Calais as a key military camp. Then it was the Germans who used Calais as the site from which England was bombed. So Calais was almost destroyed in the Second World War. Yet, like after almost a century from the wars, we still find that it still has that connecting link appeal between the UK and the rest of Europe. Now, what happened is that like in 1994, the Channel Tunnel or the Eurotunnel was established. Eurotunnel is actually the company which runs the Channel Tunnels. So it's the world's longest undersea route, railway route, which connects directly from European mainland and the United Kingdom. And after that, like from 1994 onwards, actually, there was a steady flow of refugees who would, you know, try to fit into lorries, which are unguarded, and then cross over the Strait of Dover into the United Kingdom. So the Eurotunnel changed the game for Calais in terms of security. And we see that the French Red Cross, or La Croix Rouge Française, started in 1999, what was the first refugee camp in Calais. Sanjay sir, can you tell me how much time I have left? I just want to make sure. Sorry, I can't hear you. Okay, I'll just continue.
6 minutes, 6 minutes.
All right, thank you, sir. So Sangat or Zangat was the first refugee center that was set up by the French Red Cross, and it was meant to house 200 refugees, but it ended up housing over 2,000 at one point when London actually pressurized Nicolas Sarkozy's government to shut it down because they were concerned about the illegal crossings of the Channel. And close to 68,000 refugees passed by from 1999 to 2002, when Sangat was finally closed by Paris under pressure from London. And I just wanted to make this point about Zangat being the first refugee camp, which center, actually not a camp, because in 2016, Calais shot up in international media coverage because what was known as a jungle, which hosted, so when Zangat was dismantled, around France and Britain took up 3/4 of the migrants, like 1,200 were accommodated in Britain and 3,600 in France. And then the rest of the 200 migrants who were unregistered, I'm sorry, I'm using the word migrants because of the data, but it's essentially the refugees. They started squatting around the woods of northern France. And then it was the first jungle was born. So that around a decade and a half later became 20 times its size and was demolished in late October 2016. So this is the history of Calais in terms of refugee camps and settlements. Now, the next part of my paper talks about the politics of Brexit, because it's an important aspect that I'm looking at, but I will not run you through it, because a lot of presentations have already been made about how David Cameron to Theresa May to Boris Johnson have been trying to fix the deal. Now, what I'll talk about, however, is the border security relations between France and Britain, because it becomes very important at this time when the UK has finally withdrawn from the European Union. So there are two agreements that I want to draw your attention to. The first is the Touquet or La Touquet agreement, which took place in 2003, and it's still like a substantial part of the border security regime, because it allows for juxtaposed border controls at French and British seaports, essentially moving the French border up to Dover in Kent, Folkestone, and then it moves the UK border to Calais. So British police can actually carry out checks in French territory, and Britain provides huge amount of money for this to the French government. So it becomes like an important part of the military industrial complex. And the next part is that recently in 2000, as latest as November 2020, the Home Secretary of Britain, Priti Patel, and the Ministry of the Interior of France, they actually signed an agreement which extends what Emmanuel Macron and Theresa May had signed in Sandhurst Academy in 2018, which essentially gives the French government a lot of money. Now I'll move forward and actually come to the methodology that I used. For this research paper, I contacted 10 organizations, including Amnesty International UK, Help Refugees, La Auberge des Migrants, Médecins du Monde, Doctors of the World, Refugee Youth Service, Refugee Infobus, Utopia 56, Human Rights Observers, La Croix-Rouge Français, or the French Red Cross, and Calais for Care for Calais. So I presented them with this common set of questions, which was, how has COVID-19 affected the lives of the refugees in the Calais region? Could you list out the ways in which your organization has helped out those who were most affected and vulnerable? What are the challenges that you faced most during your volunteering work? And would you share the data and estimates about how many refugees and accompanied minors are presently living in northern France, Calais and Dunkirk? So while I did not hear back from three organizations, one has put me on hold. I did hear back from Amnesty and some other organizations, but mostly they were directing me towards their sites and reports which are already available on the internet. Only one organization, very interesting organization called Refugee Youth Service, which works with unaccompanied minor children, provided me with important data. And I'd like to share some of the findings of my study. So a number of 8 organizations working on the ground in Calais and the coastal areas of northern France report a decline in the number of refugees presently living in the area. This comes at a time, however, when the channel crossings, please mind this, when the channel crossings have increased from 1,835 in the year 2019 to over 8,000 in the previous year, which is 2020. So it's 4 times more people have crossed the English Channel, according to data by the British government. So now, how many people are currently living in Calais? Most estimates, and especially Help Refugees, which is also now known as Choose Love, estimates that there are now over 1,500 people living in the forests of northern France, and 200 of them are unaccompanied children. Now, COVID-19 has affected the availability of volunteers on whom most of the refugees rely for their basic amenities, because of what I will now chart out in the final. I'm concluding. This is the final part of my presentation. So these are some of the trends. I'm sorry that I couldn't share all the findings, but I'll just try to make last comments. So some of the trends that I have mapped out from my study is that the Calais, Dunkirk and its surrounding areas have been a historical route directing the movement of people and persons and goods from the European mainland towards the UK, with long drawn-out conflict in the MENA region, some parts of South Asia. Migration of displaced and distressed persons towards the UK is unlikely to abate in the near future, despite stringent measures, despite money being pumped into preventing it. Now, one of the prime reasons for this is that in the Anglosphere, which can be Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, and all the in English-speaking world, the UK is one of the easiest countries to reach without legal documentation and using a shorter sea route as compared to other countries. The asylum policy of the UK, which by the way has now fallen out of Dublin III regulations because of Brexit, has very little to do with this geographical reality. Now, the next part is the role played by the French security forces and the French government. This is the third last point. The role played by the French.
But you don't have time. 1 minute.
All right, thank you, sir. I'll take that. The role played by the French security forces and the French government has been varied and dynamic. They've been playing the part of the good cop, bad cop, because on the one hand, we find there has been a pattern of humanitarian aid work, like distribution of meals, relocation of refugees, way better than the United Kingdom, and coordination of agencies. Like they helped set up the first refugee center in Zangat. It was Sarkozy who actually had set that up, but they're under immense pressure from the British government, which provides them a lot of money, and so they cannot continue not like interfering in the work of the aid agencies. Another reason why police brutality, abuses, and violence is carried out against the refugees in Calais is because the attitudes of the local, which is my second last point, the attitudes of the local population in the towns of France, such as Calais, have been fraught with concerns over security, although a French Red Cross report clearly suggests that there has been no rise in criminality because of the presence of migrants, but it's just public attitude, which is, fortified by populist nationalist parties of France, like Front National, and they build on it for political reasons. Now, lastly, I want to highlight that after all, it's military relations, like border security, financial expenditure between France and Britain remains an integral part of determining the lives of the refugees of Calais. The last thing that I'm going to say is that for those living in Calais, everyday life is rife with the dangers of harsh weather conditions, police brutality, unsanitary living conditions, and presently the threat of contracting the COVID-19 virus. In such a scenario, a lot depends upon the unholy trinity of aid agencies, security forces, and larger government policies on granting shelter and asylum to the refugees, all of which are key factors in shaping and defining the lives of refugees in Calais, Dunkirk, and the surrounding coastal regions of northern France, which border the busiest shipping route in the world, the fortified English Channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanskriti, for highlighting the plight of refugees as against migrants, refugees who have been forced to flee, unlike migrants who have a choice. I mean, by choice, they make a move. So thank you. We barely have 5-7 minutes left for some Q&A. So very pointed questions, please. Would you like to give questions in writing in the chat box, or maybe you can speak, but very short and pointed?
Sir, some questions have already been answered over the chat room by.
So do you want some questions to be answered even now, or maybe I can take the liberty of speaking for 2-3 minutes, and I'll definitely end at, yes, but still,
We have
if
one
someone
question from Prakash Bhatt.
please.
What is the problem in migration when there is shortage of human resources in EU? He has opened for the panel.
Yes, but yes. And who would like to answer? In fact, the European ambassador yesterday talked about how many of these migrants are required in Europe. They infuse new blood, they infuse, labor force. And there are no other takers within Europe. But anyone who would like to answer this? Bhashwati wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to, okay, have I unmuted myself? Yes.
Yes.
So I just wanted to, they were excellent presentations, and I'm really happy that, at the end of the day, everybody is so energetic. And parallelly, as Nikhil pointed out, there was this question and answer session going on in the chat box. Just one comment on Saroj's presentation. Saroj, excellent. You packed so many things in 10 minutes. You have really arrived, because 10 minutes for you, I know, is nothing, but you managed. Only one comment is, you made this comparison between the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view. Bird's eye and the worms, right? So which who is winning?
No,
The
it's
bird
not
and the worm, because
no,
in
it's it's not about it's basically a to and fro, in the sense that sometimes you feel that the bird's eye view is prevalent. But if you actually look at different critical moments in the evolution of European Union story, and basically in the last 2 decades or so, then you actually realize that it's a contestation which is perennially going on. So for instance, the failure of the Constitution Treaty, and when Niyat was voted, when France voted for it, and then afterwards others voted for it, Václav Klaus at that point in time in a book had very famously said, when these green representatives from European Parliament had spoken to him, he said that nobody had spoken to me like this ever in life, and nobody speaks like this to a president. So the point actually is that, or you look at the 2008 crisis, you want to hold the union together, you want to have a meta discourse, you want to actually set up certain principles, but simultaneously when the crisis hits, then basically, and when others say that fine, we want to dissociate ourselves with the project, then you go into a kind of a tumble. So my point essentially is that this has to be a negotiated sort of an understanding, and you have to give space to it. Because another interesting thing is, I'm a student of history, so I try to look at it in a longue durée context. If you read through Jean Monnet's memoirs, something very interesting comes out in it. Monet knew these problems, or probably had a premonition about these problems, and he had a wonderful reading of European history and the past. And that is why deliberately made the whole project a surreptitious project. So the coming of the euro, or the coming of the Schengen, all of this should not come as a surprise and should not be a moment of great celebration, because Monet basically wanted an economic integration wherein you create a structure that ultimately will lead people to a certain commonality of existence, and then people will forget their cultural differences and be a part of it. But in the memory, historical memories do not fade away like that. A history of Europe has, for God's sake, been a history of wars for the last 500 years. And to my imagination, only one thing actually unites Europe, which many people may not like, and which is like one agricultural session. Europe, season. Europe, the whole of Europe is a single crop season, actually. Beyond that, you look at the West, or you actually visit Immanuel Wallerstein and the emergence of the Atlantic system and all of that, those things. But is there one Europe? This is the question that I'm all the time asking. And history tells me that no, there is not one Europe. I mean,
I suppose that would be enough, Saroj, for today. You have more than answered the question. I really want to
have it, Professor Pandey, I would be delighted if you actually try to look at the European issue from the Russian perspective, the fear of the great Russian war.
That would be interesting. And you very rightly said the history of Europe has not just been, in fact, history of wars. It has been history of migration. What we are presenting as a problem of migrants and refugees, we fail to understand that this image of people in the boat, it was only 200 years back or 500 years back, which is not a long time in history, Saroj, when the same Europeans were the boat people going to the new lands, invading, if you want to say, or setting up colonies in their imperialist project 300 years, 200 years back, Asia, Africa, before that, Americas, Australia. All right, so it's a very complex story, and migration has been,
so if I may add one thing, it's also been a history of eternally shifting boundaries, as late as, say, the Ukrainian crisis of recent times. You see, you are all the time shaping boundaries, redrawing boundaries. 1990s was the Balkan issue. So where do you, and the role that the European powers played in the Balkan issue, you see, where do you actually draw this whole, this understanding of demos? And you say, Charter of Europe, how do you bring about it if you still have ethnicities ruling so strongly about it?
Very, very correct. I have just 1 minute. I'll finally say that we have been talking as if the migrants and refugees pose a problem for Europe. We forget that these migrants and refugees are facing a bigger problem of not just identity, but their very existence. So the problem is both ways. It's a crisis for Europe. It's a crisis situation for the migrants and refugees as well. So that would be the final word, I would say. Thank you very much. Bhaswati, Gulshan, European Center. Thank you, all the paper presenters. I really enjoyed. Just like Saroj, I am also very fond of speaking. Many of you have been my students. Some of the presenters have been my MA students. And you all know, given time, I can speak for an hour on this. But today, it's enough. Thank you very much. Over to Bhaswati.
Yeah. Okay. So I just take, as per the schedule, we have actually done it 4:30, and I need to take just 5 minutes to wrap it up. So we had this 2 days, I think, and of excellent interaction, given the kind of limbo in which we were thrown because of the pandemic. We couldn't meet each other. We were not interacting with each other. So finally, I think this 2 days has given us some kind of a respite from that, and we have been able to meet our students at least virtually. Some of them I've been meeting, but as part of the organizing group, we had great fun organizing this. At least I had. I don't know, they'll speak for themselves. But at least we got to see all the students. So that's one of the big takeaways of this conference, which I think is important. The other thing is many of the issues which have come up in terms of what Sanjay also talked of, that, if you look at it in terms of, if you're trying to understand the topic with which we started, immigration and Europe. So migration is something which is not recent, but it's human mobility has been a part of human life in one sense. But at the same time, the kind of mobility and the opportunities of mobility and connections, even if you are not mobile, the way you can connect, and some of the papers and presentations on social media actually show that connection, how you build those connections, right? For instance, also Nikhil's paper in terms of transnational populism. So these kind of connections which we can easily make now, this actually creates complexity on the questions of human mobility in a different way. So while acknowledging the fact that is human mobility has been a part of our lives, we need to also acknowledge that it is qualitatively quite different in terms of how we connect and how we move. And because we are also moving, and we are moving in the context of nation states, therefore borders and border controls also become important. So the whole idea of looking at this was, this is an issue which is, as somebody said, that it is going to be here for at least the next few years that we can see in Europe. Even if the refugee crisis per se 2015 has, one could say, subsided in terms of the numbers of people who had come in, but the issues that they have raised and the people who have already come in and accommodating them, integrating them, those are long-term issues, right? So these questions will be there. And the other thing, I think, which was pointed out in the inaugural session by the ambassador was looking at the program, when he had said that, we have the program actually looks at more of negatives in terms of how Europe has managed the question of mobility and refugees. So most of them are talking about, say, rise of populism, or talking about Islamophobia. But I think you would have been happy to see the Evangelist paper, which actually talks about the positives, which are the positive experiments which are being done in Europe, and how, as I said, when we have to live together, people actually come around and find ways and means of doing that. So I think that is one of the positives which we could see in terms of the papers presented. And for me, the takeaway is that also that we have excellent research scholars at the center and in the school. They have presented very, very good, rich papers. And I want to actually also tell you all about the Jean Monnet project, which currently part of which is this one event. I want to share with you all that we are in the process of putting up a website of this module and the chair, at which I sort of want all of you to contribute in terms of the research that you are doing, the issues with which you engage with. So you can share those and send it to us in terms of as short commentaries or papers if you so wish to. And we can all use that as a platform where we can interact and we can have news about Europe, about what the center is doing, about what you as researchers are doing, and we can actually use that information for other students across different universities. And I'm very happy the students from Bangalore University have joined in, and there I can see in the chat box, putting up questions, and also I think from Kashmir, Nasreen is from, I think, Kashmir, who has joined in. So I'm really happy that we have been able to reach out to these students, and I'm sure that this is something which is going to continue. One more information which I want to share with you is in April, 19th to 23rd of April, we are organizing a series of lecture on the Nordics, which will be held in the evening, so nobody can have an excuse of a class. So we will reach out to you and send you the schedule of those lectures. This would be actually a series of lectures on this one particular region, but it would be followed by similar series on other regions of Europe. The whole idea is to give the students who are already engaged in the center in working on these various regions, and who are also now going to get into research, to give them a holistic idea about these regions. So these series would be basically looking at the politics, society, history, foreign policy, all whole idea. So as I said, that this is something which is going to, I'm going to again circulate this, and I hope all of you will join me there. And I want to thank the organizing team, right? So Sanskriti, Nikhil, Yash, Sumbul, and Anshu, they have been really working very hard to put this together, and I think they have put up a very good show. They have managed it so well. They have put me in the background, said you don't have to do anything because we're going to mess it up. So we will do, and we will manage everything. And I think they have done excellent.
You forgot Devanjali's name.
Oh, I forgot Devanjali's name. I couldn't have done that. So Devanjali, you are included in this. Don't be offended. And I also want to thank my center colleagues, because they've always been very supportive, and also my SIS colleagues and friends. I need to mention Preeti because she has been there all along. And that's about it for today. Calling it, I have had a wonderful time here these 2 days. I hope you all enjoyed. We will also try, and that's the most important academic part of it, we'll try and bring a volume of the conference proceedings. So reach out to you to finalize, give us a final version of your papers. So we will select some. So you polish your papers as much as you can, in that one volume. So that's about it. Thank you very much. If anybody has to add anything, please, you can do that. Anybody wants to add anything, or we call it a day?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you. Is one of the best session I have attended, and the papers were very nice and well planned and organized one. And yes, Europe has a very big issue of migration. Still, things are to be settled because Brexit itself is a very difficult issue. But good is that though migration is uneven, but still integration as an integrated entity, Europe is an example in front of South Asia also. We should learn many things from them. The non-violent setups they have, also very, very inspiring one for South Asian people to learn from them. Thank you, ma'am, for inviting all the old students of yours. Thank you, Jane Monit activities, and thank you all of you.
That Dr. Shakti Raut.
Yeah, ma'am. From the organizing committee, actually, from all of us, we would not only like to thank all the participants, but also you for having made this go on without like any glitch so smoothly, and it was a lot of fun actually working over a period of a month or more. So I think, yeah, not enough credit to you. So like, I just wanted to step in to say a big thank you to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sanskriti.
Well, Center for European Studies, I just wanted to thank you for this excellent kind of presentation that the student you have enable the students to do it. This is something very nice, and I'm sure that our students also have benefited a lot. Thanks for inviting us also. Our PG students in particular were very keen on attending these things, and so whole day they sat in front of the computer listening to the presentation. I'm sure that they also have been, they are also inspired by this kind of a presentation, and I'm sure they will also, this will also actually help them to take academics very seriously. Thank you, Bhaswati. Thank you, Center for European Studies, for organizing this excellent kind of a program.
Thank you, Jairaj. Okay, let me also add for the students from Mangalore who are who have logged in. We are going to have another Young Researchers conference sometime next semester. So I will get in touch with Jairaj. You will get the required information. So if you want to participate, you can actually present papers. We would really look forward to your participation.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to congratulate the team, Bhaswati, with your permission. So great teamwork. I could see some of the mistakes which we did and how to, not to repeat those mistakes. So I have learned a lot from your Young Researchers group. So next, because this is just a beginning for our Young Researchers activity. So probably if Bhaswati permits, we'll need your help, the team, suggestions, guidance. So very good, very well organized, and looking forward to hearing from you all. Good to see Saroj and here, of course, everyone. So good. I really had good time. So thank you, Bhaswati, for giving this opportunity, and looking forward to seeing your team and looking forward to, taking their help. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Preeti. On behalf of the team, I'm assuring you that they're going to extend their help and cooperation.
Yes. Thank you.
So who is hosting this? Which young scholar is hosting this? Can we now?
Shall we end it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming and joining. Thank you the chair, Professor Sanjay Pandey, for joining us and giving us expert comments. Thank you to the organizing team again, and thank you, Professor Bhaswati, for making this happen. And I would end at this note. I know everybody is tired and waiting for their teas and snacks. So yeah, they can get back to their kitchens and get their tea and snacks, and we'll finish it right there. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Because I can have completed like 15 pages of this book. So then I'll just buy.